before we talk about sort of the different roles of economists, I think it's really important to highlight sort of two different methods of economic analysis, or two different sort of goals of economic analysis, I actually would say. The first one here is positive analysis. And I always get these confused because I'm a mathematician, and so I always think about norm. I hear the word norm and I think about measuring things. Maybe that only affects me as a mathematician, but I always get these backwards. But positive is trying to describe how the world is. This is like being the scientist. It's trying to describe, not understand sort of how the world is, and not really like thinking about how it should be, because sort of normative analysis is more trying to describe, well, I think how the world should be. So what's an example of these two that are sort of related? One example would be, for example, a normative question would be, a normative position would be, oh, I think we should fund Social Security to help pay for the elderly to retire and have more stable lives in retirement. So that would be a sort of a normative position, because we're saying, oh, we should be doing this. A positive position would be more like, for instance, if we don't sort of provide Social Security benefits to the elderly, this will be the impact on GDP. This will be the impact on growth. It's sort of trying to measure things. It's not really trying to prescribe. And so, you'll actually be asked to sort of think about this in our group discussion this week. If what you're going to be presented with something and you're going to be asked, is it positive analysis or normative analysis? And the key thing to remember is positive is just trying to explain the world, while normative is trying to say, oh, we should, hopefully this is what we should do to improve the world. And you can disagree. I mean, people disagree on both points. There's sort of lots of debate on both points. There's lots of economists who sort of who participate in normative debates, but there's also lots of debates in the positive analysis world, more so on methodology and how to do things. Okay, so the first role of an economist. Well, we were talking about before, economics is a science, and well, that means that the economist has to be a scientist. So really, the economist's role as a scientist is to do mostly positive analysis, to develop theories and models and try to support those theories with the data. And that's really what they just sort of take their little scientific role, and they just research the way the world is. And so economists here, they primarily work sort of in academic institutions, though there's think tanks. The big ones here are like Brookings. You see the Brookings Institute, and then Cato would be another big one. There's a whole bunch of these little think tanks. You walk anywhere in DC, there will be a think tank. And then the government actually hires some economists as scientists. So not to keep thinking about the Federal Reserve Board, but the Federal Reserve Board hires a bunch of sort of economists as scientists to answer questions that Reserve Board members want to know. Like, for instance, what will be the impact of this new, never before implemented monetary policy? And the economist tries to figure that out. Okay, the next big role of an economist would be as a policy advisor. So this is more sort of on the political side. So this actually has a sort of dual role as both a positive and a normative role. The positive role would be, for instance, let's say one of the most famous economists as a policy advisor is the chairperson of the Council of Economic Advisors. This is an economist who advises the President of the United States on sort of economic policy. So one thing is the president might go to his chair of the CEA, this is the Council of Economic Advisors, is the CEA, and might say, oh, well, I would like to implement this change to the tax policy. For instance, in 2017, President Trump implemented the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was a tax cut to mostly business rates, the corporate tax rate, and actually some tax rates for some tax stuff for non-corporate stuff. And he's like, I want you to produce a projection of what the impact of this tax change will be. And that's sort of the positive aspect. But there's also normative aspects in that these economists will go out and argue either to the president for a policy position using their positive analysis, or they'll argue for the president to Congress, saying this is what our policy should be, and sort of make more of a normative analysis. So there's economists all over DC. They're everywhere. I think there's actually a surprising number, like I said, the CEA, the Council of Economic Advisors, advises the president. Anytime there's an economic crisis, you constantly hear about the Federal Reserve and what the Fed's doing. I haven't worn my Fed polo today. I knew we were talking about the Fed, so I had to wear my Federal Reserve Board polo. Anyway, so the Fed, what they're doing, what is the Fed raising rates? Is the Fed lowering rates? Are they doing QE? You always hear about the Fed, and they hire a whole bunch of economists. Anytime there's a big tax change, you hear about the Congressional Budget Office, and they will basically advise Congress on sort of the budget implications. That is the implication to the deficit and the debt, the national debt, to any change they want to do Congress wants to do in spending or do in tax collection. I mean, even the Department of Justice has economists. You hear about these guys or women when there is any big sort of merger between two companies, and they're looking at, oh, well, there's concerns that this company might have a monopoly or have some monopoly powers, which the law prohibits. And the Department of Justice economists produce analysis to actually look at these antitrust cases. We'll talk about them and their sort of heyday in the 80s in a couple of weeks. I think module 9. Okay, anyway. So the last big role for economists is sort of in business. There's all kinds of economists throughout business, and if you do your econ major, you'll probably end up, and you do your econ major and you're sort of not so sold on doing a PhD. I'll be sad, but there's lots of roles for businesses. There's lots of roles in businesses for economists. A big one is consulting. So lots of businesses are really good at their area. They know, let's just say, for example, restaurants. Restaurant owners know a lot about the restaurant industry, but they might not know about broader economic conditions. And so they'll hire a consultant to help them plan for sort of broader economy. For instance, they might hire consultants to think about sort of how the macroeconomic policy of the government is going to impact the macroeconomic policy of the government plus unemployment going to impact their restaurant operations. There's also all kinds of other ones in finance and management. Really, any business role, you'll find economists in it. Okay, so that was sort of a brief overview of what economics is. I think as we go throughout the course, you'll sort of get a better idea of what it is and what it isn't. I mean, there's lots of people who think they know what it is, and they're sort of surprised because it's not necessarily the economics you see on TV, as I always like to think about it.